Right. Good, everybody. Welcome. Welcome. Almost a YouTube channel. Welcome to another monthly lecture, because we have now moved to YouTube, so you will find this monthly lecture on YouTube. Today's guest lecture doesn't really need introduction. We all know him. He's our father. He's a founding member. He's a council. And it's quite a great honor and privilege today to have him here. And without wasting any further time, today's topic is race, law, and decoloniality. For those who are joining us virtually, SC will make, okay, there's no presentation, but there will be this lecture. And at the end of it, we can take questions. So please do post your questions on the chat side, or do raise your hands if you need. Please keep your microphones muted and your camera throughout this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I realized I thought I was going to be sitting alone. Yeah, so in plan that there would be people in front of me. But anyway, the three components of this lecture are: there's a body of literature on each one of them. On race, there is a whole body of literature on law, and that's what most of you are about. And there's a whole developing body of literature on decoloniality and what it is. And of course, I suppose this lecture was controversial, or is, because many people just don't see or don't want to see the link between politics and law. And so I want to attempt to repeat again, as I always say, that the idea that the two, that politics and law are not linked, is a myth. Sometimes it's a device designed advancement of a political agenda. And so you tell people that law is neutral. And so I thought I should start with a quote. Someone who writes about neoliberalism. Right? For any way of thought to become dominant, a conceptual apparatus has to be advanced that appeals to our intuition and instincts, to our values and desires, as well as to the possibilities, to the possibilities of inherent in the social world we inhabit, close quote. It means the idea that we have that becomes common sense, that we think is neutral. It's because over time has been part of the knowledge system that taught us what we know. And so those of you who believe that there is a solid line between law and politics, it's because that idea, which is a myth, has become common sense. And we do not realize that the words, the phrases, the concepts that are in law, that are in legislation, that are in the culture, develop from certain norms and values of a particular society. So I'm going to try today to mix the three and deal with each one of them, and maybe in the end tell you why, in the South African context in particular, these three require our critical engagement at all times. As I said, the words that are used in law, the phrases, the culture, the attire sometimes, the language, and everything that we do originates from a particular outlook. And later I'm going to ask Professor Ivan Chai, who's here, who asked to join me. He does deal with Pan-Africanism and law more. So when he can assist us, I'll ask him too. He's here. We don't know him. He's also a member of us. So what I do today is to introduce you to these three concepts of race, of law, and of politics. I mean, of decoloniality and what they are. And I want to say at the beginning that each law is related to the norms of that society. It means it develops, it originates from how that society wants to organize its power and wants to organize its social relations. Of course, over time, it becomes just law of contract, law of property, constitutional law, whatever it is. And people over time separate it from where it comes from. But it comes from the same attitudes in that society. And it's related to dominant attitudes in a society. So it's not a valueless, neutral concept. And anyone who tells you that it's valueless, it's neutral, you can separate it from politics, is being political. The person who tells you that law is separate from politics is being political. He's trying to dissuade you from seeing the political nature of law. Now, of course, I begin with obvious questions about race. And the reason I included race, it could be gender, it could be class, but we'll have other classes about this, lectures about this. Is that race has been a dominant feature in social relations in society for a very long time. Slavery was based on it. Distribution in colonized continents and countries was based on race. Someone, when I was walking down a European city, told me how big the cities are. And it's quite amazing to watch a city of Paris, London, and how different it is. Until I asked this person, do you think they would have built this without slaves? They have built this city without slaves. And so, and without the laws that made it legal to have a slave. And there are laws that come from democratic societies that regarded and still do regard those who are Black and those who are women as not human. And so even concepts like human rights have become controversial. They shouldn't be. They are controversial because we're still battling with who's human. We've not agreed, at least internally, we've not agreed about who's human. We say we do. So there's a great deal of debate about the issue of race and whether it's still important. And it has defined relations, even wealth distribution, but it has defined how law is produced. So whatever we see as law, even law of property, how we acquire property, how we acquire ownership. In countries like South Africa, it has had to be based, it has been based on race. And so for a long time, race has defined what laws we produce. And people say, but you can separate it from politics in court or anywhere. You can't, because law is an instrument by which that society enforces its social relations. It depends on which class, which group, race or class or gender is dominant in that society. Now, it doesn't matter which society. And some people believe that in a post-apartheid South Africa, because you've gone over what was called, let's call it overt racism. They call it the post-racial society. Racism could even be worse in a setup like that because it's subtle and it's found in documents. It's pushed through phrases that look and sound. So the instrument of law has always been an instrument by which that given society, which is political, and if we accept that politics refers to the organization of power, how power is organized. Law is the enabling tool of that decision on how society organizes power. It either gives that power to those who are males, or it gives that power to those who are wealthy, or it gives that power to those who are white, or it gives that power to those who are wealthy. Depends on that society. In other societies, it gives that power to a particular family, that lineage. And there are many societies organized that way. And once a society has agreed that these are its relations, these are its norms, it then creates law to enforce it. Once a society has agreed that women are not human, it then creates laws to enforce it. Or blacks are not human, it then creates a law. And South Africa has examples of that. It then law also decides which language to inculcate those values. So the fact that we are having this lecture in English and that in court we speak in English is no accident. It means I can never, ever be able to express my lived experience fully in the legal profession because I can never speak my language. And that on its own is a political decision about how power is organized. So there is no point in saying law is not political. So race is an important factor. And then racism is the sharp edge that emerges from that process of othering, which we call racism. It starts, if you trace racism, you will see that before it's made law, it starts with the process of othering, which is natural. People tend to associate it with those who are like them, who are short like them, who are brown like them, big like them, tall like them. It develops into different societies. But of course, it takes a particular turn when it mixed with organization of power in war. And people, because of race, see different things differently, or the same things differently. The fact that the world can watch every day in the news a particular race in Palestine bombed every day without any real feeling tells you the importance of race, of dehumanizing a race, even legally. So that's law and how it's influenced by race. Now, the concept of decoloniality comes from the fact that in the continents that have been colonized, you can trace this back as far as you want since the arrival of Europeans in Africa and in other continents. There aren't many continents where, in fact, I don't remember, where Africans were colonized white people. So I don't have an example. But in the continents that were colonized, the process of colonizing, because a lot of people will ask, is there a difference between colonization of a people and decoloniality, and coloniality? Now, these terms have been used by academics, sometimes interchangeably. Now, let me start with colonization before we deal with what coloniality and decoloniality are. The process of physically occupying a particular jurisdiction and its people and to plunder its wealth and land is colonization. And it's assisted at a later stage by instruments of law. Everywhere you go, even slavery, even in democratic societies, so-called, they've had oppression, slavery. Women were not voting. Black people did not vote. Now that process is colonization. Now, of course, colonization can end. It means the physical occupation of a foreign jurisdiction by a foreign power can officially end, as it happened in Ghana in 1960 and in Belgium, and some people say here. It means it's the official departure of the colonizing power. It leaves, it surrenders power. And that process historically of a physical removal of a colonizing power was called decolonization. But we are in the realm of law, which intellectually is something we imbibe, we are taught, and it's part of the knowledge systems. Coloniality is something slightly different to colonization, which is a physical occupation. It's the knowledge systems, the beliefs, the values that are inculcated in order to sustain colonization. It means in order to colonize people effectively, you must make that which is your agenda part of their knowledge system. It means it can't sustain itself if those you are colonizing do not slowly internalize and believe the myth that sustains the fact that they are occupied. And over time, that becomes second nature. It means the reason that law schools were unable to critically look at the law of property and contract. It's because what we are taught has become common sense because we were born into it. It's almost like before colonization, Africans had no societies and no systems and no laws and no instrument of compliance with set rules, which is untrue. So that process is called decoloniality, coloniality, of spreading, inculcating, controlling the minds and knowledge systems of the people we are colonizing. Of course, it happens across genders too. It's possible for males to inculcate a value among women that they are inferior to us, and they end up believing it. It's what I call patriarchy in a sketch. A person who's colonized can believe that what they know, that they are colonized, is correct. That it is correct, it's in the nature of things. Now, the process of undoing colonization, which is physically removing the Portuguese from Mozambique and physically removing the Belgians from the Congo, happens after a lot of struggles and wars, and it happens. And finally, they leave. What they leave behind is coloniality. They leave behind in the laws and the belief systems. Long after they're gone, they leave what we must undo, which is the belief that what we know, taught by them, is the only thing possible, is the only knowledge possible. And the laws that are in place are the only laws that we can conceptually come up with. And that is why most of us, really, I know many of you are confused by what I'm saying out there, because what do you want us to know? That question comes from the fact that we were born into a knowledge system that we are unable to critique. I say to people, if you ask the fish and told the fish that it's in water, it will be so shocked that you say that, because it does not know. The fish does not know. Sometimes people who are born into a particular knowledge systems, even if those knowledge systems are to their detriment, do not really know. And that's the success of a system that replaces what you knew with what it wants. It means it first tells you that you have no history. It first tells you that Africans did not have particular property relations. Our law school is the only place that has told us made us know that there are rules governing property relations. But that can't be true. But once you believe that you have no history of knowledge, well, you are part of what I call a mind that has been completely whitewashed into believing it has no history. So the process of decoloniality is not just the process of officially removing the colonizer from physically occupying the space. It's the process of undoing what was taught to you through the classroom, the court, the community, and the pulpit. Because coloniality was preached. Coloniality was through the law, knowledge, our parents, our lecturers, and what we ate and what we thought was the source of our life. And so to decolonize minds is about replacing deep-rooted knowledge systems and replacing them with new knowledge. I'm saying new knowledge because a lot of silly people ask this question. So what do you want us to do? You want us to go sit under the tree and not go to court? You know, a lot of people ask that question because they've become so frustrated with a suggestion that what they know may not be right. But the process of decoloniality is the process of critiquing what we know, rejecting what doesn't work, accepting what coincides with our new thinking. So I'm not talking about Tarzan, like I don't want you to go to the caves and sit there. No, it's a suggestion that we must critique what we know. For instance, if our constitution or our laws have the word equality, as it does, if the word equality is found in our laws, but our laws do not have a law that deals with structures that create world ethics that make people unequal, the value of that word is the same as the value of the prayer, Hail Mary, full of grace. It exists, but you've left the structures that created inequality in place. If you don't have a state bank, let me give an example. If you don't have a state bank, that means the people exercise the right to trade. When giving people that right and subjecting them to a private individual who owns a bank who can refuse it anytime they want, that right has no consequence. And a lot of those words that are found in our statutes, but we are tinkering with the structures, we leave the structures that caused inequality in place. Every right that you have means very little. And those who design these things know this by now. It's not by accident. Now, the process of decoloniality, there is a lot of debate amongst academics, but I usually leave that to academics, Prof, about who came with the term decoloniality. Was it Kwame Nkrumah? Is it the recent academics like Walter Minolio? Is it other people? It's actually not important. The process of rejecting coloniality is old. It doesn't matter who came with what term. The process of critiquing what coloniality did to us, our minds, and not believing in ourselves is known. And so decoloniality and the law is not rejecting everything that we know. It's questioning everything that we know. That's the difference. It's questioning everything that we know and how we acquire property. And how is it that people who stole, when they must return things to those from whom they stole, they created a law that makes it difficult for you to acquire what they stole from you. That's political. So the law is not neutral. It's usually imposed on us deliberately by classes that want to control social relations. And there are many authors who've talked about this, and I can direct you to literature. Bukit speaks about this, about the mind. Bukit Young speaks about this. I'm disappointed there's even someone called William Boff who writes about this. Yeah, it makes sense. And Jonathan Jansen, the professor, also writes something about decolonizing knowledge. But these are not just terms. You may disagree with the terminology. These are not just terms, and academics may differ about the emphasis of different people, but they all point to the need that in order for us to genuinely challenge vestiges of coloniality, vestiges of slavery, the only difference between South Africa and other parts of the world is that the slaves did not leave. The slaves were not shipped out of the country. They were slaves nevertheless. And they became worse than the slaves that were shipped out, because the methods of changing what they knew of themselves and their knowledge systems and their histories changed, and over centuries. And it's for that reason that we're really unable to think of law outside what we know. It's because we can't replace what we know. We were born into knowledge systems that are foreign. And it's a small thing. A lecturer asked me at Wits once, why is it that in English 3, black students are no longer there? They've been fading from English 1, and then by English 2, there are 4. By English 3, there's 2. And I said to her, tell me, what do you think? School does not say that. I said, actually, it's not true. It's because when you can't relate with the content from your life, it means you can't relate with the subject matter. It takes you much, much more to understand Chaucer and Charles Dickens. When Charles Dickens is talking about life that's very foreign to me. If the novel talked about life as I know it in Bulu general, I would find it very easy to relate with it. But I have to think twice, 3 times to relate the lifestyle that literature is talking about. And know as well, not saying that those of you from the Eastern Cape can only understand stock theft, but there is merit in realizing that actually, if not related to what is your daily experience, it would be easier to understand. Now, when law is taught and regulates relations in a way that is just foreign to you, it's a very difficult concept. And sometimes it's not foreign to you. It's detrimental to who you are. And many people don't realize that we are taught something that we swallow and we sit in class in lectures, but every sentence that's being uttered insults our being. And we're supposed to regurgitate it in an exam. So that's what decoloniality is to undo those. And that's not simple. Now, if we accept that laws themselves were instruments of maintaining control over colonized peoples, well, even if the colonizer officially leaves, even if in 1994, there is a pretense that white power has disappeared, which is truly a pretense, you are left being the one perpetuating the very thing, because you are the one that believes first that you are inferior, that what you know is not superior, and what you know doesn't make sense. How your society regulates conflict is barbaric. And as a result, you can be left perpetuating the very knowledge systems that insult your being. And then coloniality then requires us to look at law from the perspective of its liberating nature. There is no shame in that. There is no shame when you've gone through slavery, apartheid, colonialism and apartheid, to seek to revolutionize law as we know it. You can never create a liberated society, legal society with legal instruments that were created for colonial, racist and apartheid purposes. You can tinker with them there and there. The rules of court are not valid. Cross-examination as an art of arriving at the truth is not necessarily the best thing. It's just a particular attitude of a particular Western notion of getting to the truth. No one was cross-examined 400 years ago in our societies. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to cross-examine. I'm saying it's a culture that comes from a particular place about how to arrive. I almost said arrive at the truth. I'm not so sure that we arrive at any truth in court. I'm not so sure that we do. But whatever we achieve through cross-examination and the way we conduct cases, there are other methodologies in other societies of resolving conflict that may have been much better than cross-examination. And so if coloniality, as I said, is a myriad of attitudes, of values, of knowledge systems, coloniality of self, coloniality of nature and power structures founded upon the supremacy of Eurocentric viewpoint and Western ways of being and Western ways of seeing. Well, decoloniality is the process of undoing it. It's the process not of amending laws as we do. It's the process of really looking at the fundamental motives of the laws. A politician called Abasa once and asked, would we help them with the traditional courts bill? And I said to him, okay, what is it called? I said, the traditional courts bill, but gee, it's a very nice piece of legislation going to recognize. I said to him, where are we? He says, what do you mean? I said, so you're in the continent of Africa. And anything to do with Black people, you call it traditional. Mainstream. What is mainstream if you call what is about you, the majority, traditional? And he said, yeah, maybe we should have spoken before we named it. I said, no, you can't, but it just tells you what we think of ourselves. What we think of ourselves. We go to university, and at Vets we used to be taught by, I think it was Professor Menez, yeah, customary law. In my own continent, everything else I'm taught is called by its name. This one thing that recognizes how historically people of this continent govern their affairs is marginal. And that actually is symbolic of how we deal with knowledge generally. We're unable to critique it. So everything about us is marginal. It's on the peripheries, on the margins of the human condition of knowledge. And the process of decoloniality is to undo that. And that's why Ngugi says a very important point in a Bantu Bigo lecture that he made. Says colonialism tried to control the memory of the colonized, or rather to borrow from the Caribbean thinker Sylvia Wynne. It tried to subject the colonized to its memory to make the colonized see themselves through the hegemonic memory of the colonized center. Put another way, the colonizing presence tried to mutilate the memory of the colonized. And where that failed, it dismembered it. And then tried to remember it to the colonizers, to the colonizers' memory. His way of defining the world, including his take on the nature of the relations between the colonizer and the colonized, and how the colonized sees himself. This relation was primarily economic, for nobody colonizes another for the aesthetic joy of simply doing it. The colonized as worker, as peasant, produces for another, writes laws for himself, to preserve property for themselves. His land and his labor benefits another. This is, of course, affected through political power, but it is also accomplished through cultural subjugation, the control of the entire education system, for instance. The ultimate goal being to establish psychic dominance on the part of the colonizer and psychic submission on the part of the colonized. Close quote. You could take this to everything we subject ourselves to, whether in court or knowledge. What we think is common sense, what we do not question. It means we accept it as something that cannot be changed. We do not question its motive. And of course, the aim for coloniality is to change the mind so that the mind believes that its own subjugation is okay. Now, as I said, all of these three components are very difficult to deal with because in law in particular, someone has written a book, the Americans have written about this law. I think they were much more open about writing about race and the law than we have been. It's a book about implicit bias in law. And he writes that the problem with law and bias is that the knowledge about law that we are taught is created at a time when one race is deemed inferior to the other. And because it's reinforced over time, the bias lies even below lines of consciousness. It means we are not aware. That's why many people are very disappointed when you call them biased. All of us can ask you in this room, no one's biased in this room, no one is racist, no one is sexist. No one is, I always say racism is a popular sport without players. It's there, everyone knows it's there, but then no one is it. No one is the player. It's because it exists in us. Sometimes we are unaware, but sometimes we are aware, but it's difficult to venture into the unknown. And that is why when you say to people we are biased, they think it's an insult. And it's a recognition of what we must deal with. It means in law, in punishment, in how we mete out punishment, we're still driven by our preconceived ideas, our stereotypes. The best thing about bias in law, particularly for judges and lawyers, is being aware. Is being aware that you are biased. And so when I talk about bias in law, people say, what does he say we must do? When we do our best, and he goes out and insults us. No. The awareness of one's bias is the only thing I'm asking for. It's not that you shouldn't be biased. So when we ask people to recuse themselves, a senior counsel told me something I haven't forgotten. Gilbert Marcus, I asked Gilbert Marcus once, Gilbert, how do you deal with recusing myself when I'm doing a matter or when I'm a chair? And he said something that I actually think we all could live by. He says, you know, if you feel uncomfortable here, recuse yourself. If something inside you makes you even pause to think, am I the right person? Don't do it. So when you ask, I always think I shouldn't ask a judge to recuse themselves if it's obvious. But the levels of depravity in our profession and society are such that I must tell an old man who knows that he's biased, who knows that he hates this litigant. I must tell him that you know that you hate this litigant. You therefore not the right person to adjudicate. If Daddy came before me as a judge, I would recuse myself. I know I'm not biased against him or for him, but he's my friend. If Matthew came before me and I'm acting as a judge and he's a litigant, I would recuse myself. It's not because I believe that I'm unfair. It's because it's the right thing to do. Counsel shouldn't have to remind me that Matthew Chaskowski is my friend, and therefore I'm not the right person to adjudicate. So that I must argue rounds out for the whole day to tell someone who was sitting at a wedding of another as a friend, you may not be the right person. Is a symbol and a sign of the levels of depravity, and that we are unaware of our biases. But secondly, not just we're not aware of our biases, we actually don't care. And it's because at the heart of law, we've not been able to realize over history that law and justice are not the same. Law has always been there, even when women did not vote, even when they were slaves. Even today, there are still laws. And others are bold enough to say we have the best constitution. Doesn't matter that 70% of our people live in abject poverty, still the best document. It's because we are unaware that we represent our class position. And so in analyzing legal instruments, we are unable to say it is law for what. In fact, there's an author who asks a question, Dennis Lloyd. First of all, do we need law? Why do we need law? And a lot of people, of course, this question is redundant. And so what do you want? You want people to walk around, do what they like. When he asks the question, he says it's something for another debate, whether law is good for justice, or man is good enough left on their own to be just. Because law is usually unjust. And when we ask courts and everyone, South Africa has courts of law. And we still have a moment to create courts of justice. We haven't. And so the concept of law is the one that must go through the process of ridding itself of elements that seek to subjugate Africans. We don't do this deliberately. That's why I call it law, race, and decoloniality. I didn't call it racism deliberately because there are no racists in South Africa. I call it race because we are unaware how in creating laws and arguing for them, we may be perpetuating that which we declare we don't want. The laws that we made, when I said to the guy who called me about the traditional court bill, I genuinely believe he was surprised that I was not impressed. He thought he was telling me something revolutionary. Until I said to him, but why do you call something African peripheral? What is mainstream? he hasn't answered me today. It's been a year. So tell me, if it's traditional, I'm not saying, tell me what's mainstream and tell me why it's correct in the continent of Africa that what is African is called by some name, which means it's on the fringes. It means the phrases we use also symbolize our attitude towards a particular race, a particular way of being, and a particular way of seeing, and a particular philosophy of life. And we do this unaware. And so the concept of law for me is one that must go through the process of decoloniality because it exists in our minds. I mean, a couple of years ago, attorneys have not been known to march and fight. And one of the things when I started practice that really surprised me was that attorneys fought and succeeded that they must wear gowns and bibs like advocates. I was so saddened that of all things, our attorneys were fighting to wear some colonial garb when the battle should be to question, why are we wearing this? Arona has written a very good paper analyzing the history of the attire. And that attorneys in Kenya and elsewhere in Nigeria were fought to keep the wig during independence. It's the only thing they fought for. They didn't fight for a law that changes property relations, no. They didn't fight for a law that changes banks and mines to be owned by the indigenous people. No, we want our wigs. You ask a court in this country, I asked a court in this country to speak for 10 minutes in Zulu. And it was rejected by a South African court. It refused that I speak in my mother tongue in court. She was just even embarrassed. No, Mrs. Kakali, what will people say? Please forgive me, but I can't answer. And I could see how sheepish he was. He couldn't imagine what the wide world would do, because the wide world matters in our courts and what we do. And so the concept of law for me is something that's not neutral. And there are many cases that, I don't want to quote the South African ones, but there are many cases where it's very clear that we've not applied our mind to what we know, the correctness of what we've become accustomed to as law. We've not been able to realize that at the heart of law as we practice it is a carryover of things as they were. We've not realized that we actually do not have a law or any law that fundamentally reverses the structure of our economy. And that's why I started by saying, if you do not have a law that transfers back strategic assets of a country that was stolen to its people, the word equality has the value of a prayer. It will always be a prayer and nothing else, because you are refusing to fundamentally deal with what causes equality. You are happy to declare that you want equality. And so those are the concepts, and that's how the two are linked. I'm going to ask Isaac to deal with the part that I said. He said he would just for 2 minutes deal with it, and how this affects legal culture. Legal culture is quite different because it's something we grew up wanting to walk down the street in a gown. And now Moses kind of says we must not wear this. It's a very painful thing for others. Even when we're doing sub A, you saw yourself. And it takes a lot for me to tell you that you look ridiculous in there. And that it doesn't represent you. I'm not saying it's ridiculous. I'm just saying it's not neutral. Of the courts The buildings are not neutral. The universities are not neutral. The shape, the architecture of round like a lag, is not neutral. There is African power in how it's structured. There is a security consciousness that you can see in a building that was built when some races were inferior. You go to the city of Joburg building, you can see when you are there, when it was built and why it was built. And you can see apartheid architecture of control. Thank you. That's right. Sorry, what is that? All right, so hey guys, it's the equivalent of grade 1. Grade R.
Good afternoon, colleague. As the indicate, my name is Isaac Shine, and I have requested him so many times not to call him Prof, but he insists. Not because I'm not one, it's just like I prefer not to have any form of critics. How I'm described. And I must say it's quite a pleasure to be part of an organization comprising great men and women, great advocates, some of them here today, and great SC Mpofu. I also, as he was speaking, that as an organization, I think you need to protect our members. There is beginning to be what I can only call a very silly approach that begins to problematize those that dare to think differently and say different things. As Kakali, as Mpofu, and many others. And I think we need to protect them. I was hijacked.
Part of the coloniality.
I was hijacked to come here, and will then have to forgive me based on that. When I moved from one corner to the other, I may be a bit distracted there and there, but I will try my best within the few times that we have. I want to just, there's this quote by, I think it's from Infinite Riches by Ben Ock. That fascinates me, that I think should always be the context. Whenever about decoloniality, when you talk about race, when you talk about law. And this is those who have read Ben Ock's Infinite Riches or sorry? Yes, Astonishing, and many other books. They'll know that it's the spiritual child who is in all, well, most of his work, and well, the name of the spiritual child is Azaro. And there's a point where he's speaking to his father, I think, or is the father speaking to him. I did indicate that was hijacked. And he says, who can be certain where the end begins? Time is growing, and our suffering is growing too. When will our suffering bear fruit? One great thought can alter the future of the world. One revelation of evolution one revelation, one dream. But who will dream that dream? And who will make it real? Time is growing, and our suffering is growing too. We have talking about transformation of the legal profession. It's been years. Time is growing. And still, our suffering is growing too. And I think for me, everything, particularly as Black legal practitioners, as Black lawyers, as Black counsel, this is something that we need to consider. We should always locate all our approaches in this context of time that is growing with our suffering that is growing too. And I do think that what SC was talking about is exactly what is said in this book when Okri says that one, but who will dream that dream and who will make it happen? I think Pavasa is poised in a good position to make that dream happen. So that for me is the context within which I locate every other thing. Yes, he did say that I briefly touch on the issue of legal cartel, and if you can just give me two minutes. You know, I'll give you this example here of a couple of stories, sorry. And they may look unrelated, but you see how related they are, at least within the context of legal culture. So a book that is titled From Logics of Memory to Nomadic Masks. Peter Goodrich is a scholar. Cites an unreported decision of the Supreme Court of Columbia, which involved the Haiti Nation, which defended an application by a company called Western Forest Products at WFP for an injunction to prevent the Haida members from interfering with the FPL looking activities on traditional Haida land. So what happened is that on the day of the proceedings, the Haida arrived at the court in ceremonial dress. They refused to appoint a lawyer and called witnesses who told stories, who sang songs and produced sculptures to defend their claim that they had exclusive rights over the Haida land. They went to court, they said, we have a particular relationship, and we do not think that if you were to appoint a lawyer, that lawyer is going to be able to understand and speak to our relationship with land. Second example, still within the context of legal culture, is the Bolivian Constitution of 2009. Now, I want to read to you what the Bolivian Constitution of 2009 says. It starts by saying the following. In ancient times, mountains arose, rivers moved, and lakes were formed. Our Amazonia, our swamps, our highlands, and our plains and valleys were covered with greenery and flowers. We populated this sacred mother earth in different places, and since that time, we have understood the plurality that exists in all things and in our diversity as human beings and cultures. Thus, our people were formed, and we never knew racism until we were subjected to it during the terrible times of colonialism. We, the Bolivian people of plural composition, from the depths of history, inspired by the struggles of the past, by the anti-colonial indigenous uprising and independence, by the popular struggles of liberation, by the indigenous social and labor marches, by the water and October wars, by the struggle for land and territory, construct a new state in memory of our times. That is in the preamble of the Constitution. What does yours say? Your preamble. So what you see here is a clear indication that they, Bolivians, were saying that we are not going to be neutral. We're going to talk about our history, and we are going to talk about what needs to happen. We reject racism. It is in the Constitution. I mean, in the preamble. So, it's their way of doing things, and therefore, their culture, one can say. The last example is still within the context of legal. It's a decision by the Indian Supreme Court case, where it was held as follows. The root cause of the problem and hence its solution lies somewhere. The culture of unrestrained selfishness and greed spawned by modern neoliberal economic ideology and the false promises of ever increasing spirals of consumption, The culture of unrestrained selfishness and greed spawned by modern neoliberal economic ideology and the false promises of ever increasing spirals of consumption leading to economic growth that will lift everyone under this politically and economically unsustainable set of circumstances in vast tracts of India in general and whatever. The point here is how the judges came in and they actually critiqued neoliberalism in that case. They said that neoliberalism as an economic policy is unconstitutional because of the consequences that it spawns. That's legal culture. So the point really that I'm making here is that there isn't one way things. There isn't one legal culture. Of course, in South Africa, the dominant legal culture is conservative. It is formalist, it is positivist. And as he was saying, is because there's a reason why. The fact that you want to divorce law from politics and so forth is precisely because there's a reason for that. So the examples that I'm giving are also about the limits and promises of a particular legal culture. And once again, as I said, I was hijacked. I'm going to just end by saying the following. And I made this proposition still within the context of legal culture. That number one, modern Western law is actually based on myth. And this is the myth of the European South. We'll get more time one day to further expand on this. The second proposition that I'm going to make is that it is impossible to achieve national liberation relying on the current law and jurisprudence in this country. Possible, forget it. And I'm not being binary here. Legal culture, as I've said in South Africa, is conservative. Fourth proposition that I'm making is that the country is crying out for justice, and the attainment of justice can only be resolved through final resolution of the land country. There's no two ways about it. We need to start from the beginning in this country for the simple reason that this country is built on mythic foundations. That's a fact. We've got to do that. We've got to be uncompromising. We've got to be brave about it. We should refuse to be coward when we subject to many questions of the day that affect us to critical scrutiny. We must refuse to be told that we are malcontents. We must refuse to be labeled that we are anti-constitutional and so forth. We have to refuse for the simple reason that we are also thinking beings. The Constitution allows us to critique it, actually. And the last proposition is that when you are a lawyer in this country today, you are poor because you are Black. It's a fact. And when you are successful, it is because most of the times you are white. There's nothing to do with humanity. I'm raising these propositions as issues that we need to face at the later stage. Thank you so much.
All along. Thank you, guys. I think we're going to have a series of these lectures because these three subjects are difficult to deal with, and they are developing. And we're not having these lectures to propose solutions or answers, but the idea that we are not thinking about alternatives is itself a defeatist approach. It comes from people who've been subjected to thinking that they cannot think. And I think we've got to find a way of thinking differently. And people, when we say this, say we are constitutionalists, we must be targeted. We're just thinking, no, we may not be right. We're just doing what they have done themselves. They think and they put something on paper. We're doing the same. The fact that they think we're inferior is just a tragedy of history. We've got to think about how to make law work for the new purpose of the country, which is to be free. I will end this with this for those who think we are unconstitutionalists for linking law with decoloniality, particularly those who call themselves constitutionalists. Paulo Freire makes this point so clear about why should people in the legal field and elsewhere call themselves progressive. Doesn't matter whether you're black, white, male or female. He says the test that you are progressive is not that you deal with certain liberal notions. He says is to ask yourself the question whether you live, think, and act in solidarity with the one with whom we are solidary. So when somebody says, someone sent me a WhatsApp once, I won't say who, this organization no longer represents my voice. And I thought, and this is a progressive white lawyer, I thought it's a tragedy that people call themselves left-wing in a country whose history is apartheid and colonial. The idea of being left-wing is for those historically oppressed thinking like them. When actually it should be the other way around. It's like males. Males want women to think like them, then there will be peace. When they must see themselves from the position of a class, which is female, that has been oppressed. You may not agree with it. You may not agree with the slave and what the slave is doing. But the slave can give you some guidance about the pain it's feeling. And the most progressive way of living is to see life in the eyes of the downtrodden, to see law by analyzing its capacity to uplift. Not to uplift you, to uplift the most downtrodden. And that's what it should do. You may not like what it does. It may be true that the law that is fair may make me lose my house. It's very possible. Or job. It's very, okay. But law must be able to be developed in a country with our history, to deal with our historical reality. And the historical reality is that lack of freedom, lack of equality, lack of justice has a racial context. And it's because laws shifted property in the hands of a few, shifted humanity in the hands of a few, shifted knowledge to be controlled by a few, shifted wealth to be controlled by a few, and shifted everything we know. And the only real radical alternative in life is to fundamentally reverse that which you commit to change by law. And when Isaac talks about what the Bolivian constitution does, the difference is this: it's not polite about what it's seeking to do. Our constitution, you can't solve a problem you are scared to pronounce. Our constitution is so polite that it can't say colonialism or apartheid. It had to say injustices of power so that we don't offend. No one should be offended by what happened to us, by calling it out. Anyone who calls themselves progressive should not be ashamed to call slavery what it is. To call oppression should not make you feel ashamed. But we did this because our laws, our attitude are still based on people that are still controlled by coloniality. We are still feeling a little uncomfortable with offending a class that is superior. When we actually should create a setup, create laws, all South Africans, black or white, should be able to live by. Because if laws are not progressive, no one will be free until all of us are free. Thank you. Great question. But I thought we should just do a discussion really. We don't have answers. I just thought there are contributions, we take notes. We didn't want to give a lecture. We thought it should be a discussion about what's possible.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. That was quite insightful. Do you have any questions? There are different questions from our online participants. And then do we have any questions from the floor? We will start with our online. Let me see. Malume Fenzi, that's your name. You can ask or comment. Yeah.
The volume is fine on the computer.
We can hear.
Actually, why we do this, Judge Dennis Davis, don't usually agree with him, but he said something about legal culture that I think we should read. In one of the books, he wrote with an American scholar called Hal Clay. Says, experience, foreign visitors become acquainted with South African legal culture, often comment that certain of its distinctive features appear relatively independent of lawyers' gender and political ideology. Certain types of legal argument appeal to South African lawyers who otherwise disagree sharply on conventional assumptions about legal reasoning. The judicial role in social and economic organization inform South African legal discourse. Argument styles and reasoning chains accepted as persuasive here often seem unconvincing to sympathetic visitors. Yeah. At the same time, South African lawyers often look with suspicion, if not disbelief, upon types of argument regarded as perfectly normal in other jurisdictions such as the US. And I think he's trying to explain, you may not have, he's trying to explain that sometimes even styles of argument, things we do that look odd, other places people argue that way. And here we have a particular fashion. And if you've watched it, I've seen it develop. There's a time when a good advocate is the guy that stands up quietly to the side case law, all of this, and then in other people who are orators, who are able to articulate certain things in an interesting way. So that's a legal culture. It's part, I think he's trying to explain that there is a multiplicity of ways of doing things. Anyway, we can do it here if the people online.
Yeah. I was really on the
It's good because I'm not scared of this. I'm scared of the one that I can't see.
It's fun.
That's fun. But I don't even do it. Right. Any comment, any addition, criticism? Actually, from what I was doing, it's actually about us critiquing even what we are proposing, what we know, and in order to produce better knowledge.
I'll just say it was quite informative and it had me thinking. And I remember a few years ago, I took Google the word lawyer, could Google the images. And I could not see somebody who looks like me, represents me, somebody that I could relate to. But I've seen now there's been some change, but obviously there's still not a lot. One or two, three people if you Google the word lawyer, if you Google the word advocate, if you Google the word anything that is a profession, you will never see somebody that looks like me, looks like us. So somebody else. So already online, we have an issue. And this is where our kids are going to get education. And this is going to be a repetitive process of their thinking that this is how it is. So as you were teaching us and lecturing us, there were some of the things I had to think about. What stereotypes, what things have we repetitively seen, practiced, not questioned, we kept it moving. It's not really a question, but it's just something that I reflected back on.
Okay, thank you, Cassie. Thank you, Shai. You know, for me today was very triggering to say, I'm not asking a question, but it's just my own little 2 cents towards the conversation. It's triggering in the sense that you know, I was actually sitting here and asking myself, what has really changed since 1994? And people from my era, the kids, and we've had this conversation too. What happened in the early 90s is actually quite sick. There was a period where we were taken to white students, right? And we were the guinea pigs in the early 90s. We're supposed to be the rainbow children of this country. And the abuse that happened, the psychological abuse, the rape of the mind that happened to Black children is something that I think nobody wants to talk about, that trauma. Have to constantly perform under what Toni Morrison says is the white gaze. You always have to be a certain way, you have to speak a certain way, you have to think a certain way, you aspire to be something. You completely just remove your essence of who you are as a Black person. I'm sitting here and I'm being triggered because our generation, and I'm now saying our generation, probably in their 40s and 50s and 30s.
Oh, that's us.
We're supposed to be leading this country. We're supposed to be leading this country and talking the talk and saying what to be said, but we're still in chains psychologically, actually, because you can't even, there can't be a revolution when you don't even know who you are, right? And we're expected to come up with some form of an answer. Maybe it's better for people who have gone through apartheid, they know who they are, they understand the system. And I'm sitting here and I'm triggered because even our children are going through the same thing. And we're having these lectures in this closed up environment. But there is a whole nation out there of people who don't even have the vocabulary to express themselves. So I'm saying all of this to say thank you. Thank you for starting the discourse. Thank you for giving us the vocabulary to some of the things that we're experiencing. And I really think that to even try and change the system without having changed yourself and your narrative and who you say yourself you are, you can't even change the system that you aspire to. Now we've got a problem where, in terms of legal culture, and that's to say, we in certain circles, I remember when I did my PhD not so long ago, you get told when you are an advocate, you can't be like so and so, right? This is not the way to be an advocate. No. Yeah, so you can't even you get told. Again, it goes back to the thing of I want to discard my people. I want to aspire to be so and so, so that I get work and so on and so. I'm saying all of this to say that thank you for reminding us that we have to we have to critique the white gaze and for what it is, and also critique ourselves in the process, not necessarily critique S.C. Chakelson because he's a white person, but I mean, we know that it is about the ideology behind it. And I will stop there.
Let me start from where I want to end it, right? By this saying that we are told not to be like certain people. We've also suffered from the same criticism, and I can say that from Mr. Mpofo's point of view and Mr. Skakani's point of view, I once visited a colleague when I was doing my pupillage, his chambers. Then he says to me, what do you think of Mr. Skakani's way of doing things in court? You know, every time, I mean, you are my proper teacher, you know. No, I'm sorry, I simply say, hey, you know, speaking, I don't have a view, but you know, I'm still learning. Perhaps you can express with you. I'm sure it's all that you know where I'm coming from and the answer that will be never persisted. But now the point that I wanted to make, or the question that I wanted to ask, you know, Prof said that we need, and I was just making an example, that we need to protect you and Mr. Pope. Obviously, there are others, but it's just using that as an example. And how do we protect people like you? So my question is that, how do we reproduce people like you? How do we transfer that skill? How do we produce the bravery to the first and the next generation? Personally, I maybe must have forgotten when I joined the Dumanogo before he ran away. So I said to him, you know, I see your work, and I admire and aspire to be like you. But then, when are you giving us the baton? So that when you leave, there's no cap, you know. So that is then my question. Where do you, not just transferring skills, but the issue of reproduction of bravery to the next generation, and also to prepare our minds that we're going to be vilified, you know, if we're like certain people, and how to navigate and how to survive with that vilification.
Two people say this to us. It's actually Bram Fisher and Attire. Probably the best quotations about the lonely path of being different. His colleagues, white colleagues, called him odd. They laugh him now, but they put him through a terrible time. And they called him immoral. And in one of his, and they struck him off the road for being different. And in one of his speeches, he said, look, a time comes when an advocate must say what they think. And he says they do so not because they disrespect the law or they are immoral. They say or do what they do because they think doing nothing and saying nothing has become immoral. And he welcomes the fact that they do. Pius Langa says something similar. He says there is value in a lone ranger. And sometimes it takes a lone voice to change the course of history. And what you call courage for me is, it's always been difficult to go against, particularly in environments like law, to go against a dominant culture. You know, you say people have picked you to a lecture at the University of Western Cape, and I asked them, what's the name of the 3 white lawyers that represented people who fed our people to the pigs? They couldn't remember. But they do remember who represents Hlaba.
And so,
And Zoom or anybody. And I said,
for example,
or Jiba. I said there's a race involved there. That someone who represents just a black person, maybe a Scandinavian, a Jiba. Yeah. And I'm not saying those people are great people. They may well be terrible people. But you don't remember 3 white lawyers who represented 2 white men who fed 2 black women to their decomposing bodies to the pig. We don't remember them. We don't actually have a problem with them. And race and law is also about that. I don't mind those things because it's an old trick of canceling you out. No young person wants to be one out. It takes bravery to resist a dominant culture and a class. I usually tell young lawyers, please tell colleagues you don't like me. Works better for your career. Until you amass enough confidence to be different. As long as you know that what you are doing is right. And I think that's the area for me that I think we need to develop lawyers who can create a culture in which we're able to divorce ourselves from our attitudes. And the worst of this is actually not, is those who are black but have internalized. And I always think you must watch the movie Jungle to know what we are. That sometimes when you don't have power, you also live, I call it living at your own. You have to smile, you have to agree. You have to pretend you don't like those who are similar to you. You have to pretend you like that what is similar to you. And that's the impact of a dominant culture. And what Pius Langa says about being a lone voice, if that lone voice is true, it's something you must do. It requires courage, because the opposite is too ghastly to subject nations hundreds of years of subjugation. And in this profession, it's very difficult because lawyers are not taught to be progressive. We are taught to be conservative. Generally, we don't analyze the law, we apply it, and it's very difficult. And the legal culture in a legal environment like this is difficult. It's a small community. I'm not walk around and people tell young people, they say, it's not nice. So most of us do like to be liked a little. Yeah, but being liked for what? I think it's better to be disliked for being truthful than to be liked. People who like you because you say what they want to hear actually don't respect you. At the deep, they don't respect you. They know actually that you actually are nothing. You don't irritate them. So I think as lawyers, that for me is what we need to do in order to change the judiciary, the legal culture, and different things. And so all the language you hear, terrible language from people who call themselves progressive. No one should be targeted. Actually, the Constitution, as Shai said, allows us to critique it. It allows, and it's only going to take that ability, that confidence to critique things. In fact, the future of non-racialism for me, genuine non-racialism, that kind of robust engagement with things, even in law. And so nothing should be taboo. I'm not even sure that judges should be appointed the way they are. But that's a debate for another day, whether we should elect judges at a certain level, because the myth that people are appointed with no political agendas is itself self-deception. And so we need to be honest about it, that I am this type of person with a particular ideology. And the likelihood is that if you bought something before me as a child, it is about who must own strategic, who must own the air, space, and the mind. I'm likely to agree that that's my standpoint. No human being privately should own what we found on earth. That's my standpoint. And I can be a judge, but that's my standpoint. You don't have to hide it. But we have a system that pretends judges are neutral. And therefore, hidden in all of these things is private agendas. And so we need to have more open discussion about what are we. And the pretense of neutrality is probably the biggest threat to our democratic future. We're still doing what barbarians did centuries ago. We've modified it. We still lynch others. We are still lynching than when they did in Europe and here when people were chopping each other's heads. We don't have a machete, but we are still lynching. So what you were told is psychological lynching. You were being told to hate me, and I'm being told to hate you. And something must work against. It's very difficult. It's a very difficult thing. Don't listen to Dal when he says that he doesn't care. No one wants to be insulted every day. It's not right. So if you live with it, I'm sure he lives with it. We live with the fact that everybody says, "It's Dali on your floor." Oh no, he's called bonkers. Suburbs. I think he was kind of powerful. I'm supposed to say, this guy. But of course, when I'm not there, it's me. When you're not there, it's you. All designed to make you conform. Yeah. To conform because you don't like to be disliked. And I think lawyers, for me, I came to the legal profession because I truly believed it. And I was lucky. Matthew was my people mentor, gave me the freedom to question him and others. But I came to it because I actually thought naively, it's an intellectual environment, very robust intellectuals, honest intellectuals, a little above the biases that I saw out there. I was disappointed. Yeah, so I think we need to add out in order to create those of you who are going to be judges that are more vigorous, more honest, more intellectual, and more unashamed to say a country that has been a colony must do all that it can to reverse what being a colony is, and to reverse the subjugation of others and their mindset, to reverse the laws that have a tinge of racist attitude. And that for me is if you had asked the colleague who asked you, do you like the advocate Doberman who represents a priest that raped 12 young kids? They don't remember who it is. That on its own is because that advocate is white. Even if the person who asked me is black, there's an attitude. Whiteness is not being white. Whiteness is an attitude that has been internalized to work in anti-black fashion, even if it's towards yourself. I know exactly when I'm at Checkers, the black woman smiles when a white lady is paying and is angry with me. Exactly what it is. It's because when she sees what is like her, she sees something that must be disliked because she doesn't like herself, she's never been liked. When she sees something white, she sees something that is the repository of power and approval. And I understand it. She won't smile and say, "What?" Suddenly she's courageous and arrogant towards it, and very nice to the other person. It happens in our court. The worst for me is black prejudice. That's the worst for me. When you have a white colleague, and they will err on the side, most of the side of the white colleague. They're scared of defending your white opponent. You can see it. You can see it. They don't think we feel it. You can see that the brother is battling. But is walking on eggs. He's trying to see right here. And actually, his anti-black, internalized anti-black knowledge tells him that the person who knows less is the one similar to him. And that's something we must reverse and do with our kids and parents. As you say, you went to those schools, not us. I always think we send kids to these schools and pay 200,000 rand for an accent. We're not paying for better humanity and better human beings. We're paying for our kids to have an accent. I do it too. It's very costly.
And to hate themselves.
And yeah. Guys, thank you so much. I think we're going to take this is the person who organized it, and I think we're going to have others, and probably I thought we would take particular aspects of it. Even law of property, we will take procedural and see, analyze this. What does this say? And take all the things because I think it's probably when we engage critically with things that we will understand, know their shortcomings. And so even with the law of contract, it's something we must do to study it for what its purpose is and what it's not. Thank you.
I said, yeah, sure. I was just going to say that, the fact that it's more than, yes, the fact that he asked that question, it didn't pass an actual bravery. And the fact that it's even sitting next to SE is important.
I also try not to confirm that I when it's yes, I really have to when I do I say no. All right, guys, thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. We do have refreshments outside. Please do serve yourself.
Yeah.